seeing when they just talk about a trapezoid. But that is in actuality an isosceles trapezoid. Now, we talked about isosceles yesterday. Isosceles means the same thing it does here as it did yesterday. All right, isosceles yesterday meant two congruent sides. Isosceles trapezoid means it has two congruent sides. All right, so properties of an isosceles trapezoid. It has, first of all the properties of a regular trapezoid. Now, there's only one here, but remember, I'm only getting the most important ones. There are a lot of minor properties that I could list and probably fill 2 or 3 boards. All right. The non-parallel sides are congruent. That's this left and right side. That's how you get the isosceles part. The non-parallel sides are congruent. All right. Third one says the base angles are congruent. The base angles are congruent. There's 2 sets of base angles. The base angles are joined by the parallel side. Right? So if we're looking at this parallel side, these are my 2 base angles. If I'm looking at this parallel side, then these 2 are my base angles. Again, they're always joined by that parallel side. Right. The diagonals of an isosceles trapezoid are congruent. Diagonals have the same meaning here as they did over in kite. That's when I connect the unconnected corners, or the vertices. And that's what the dashed lines down the middle are. Those are the diagonals. And finally, the adjacent angles connected to the non-parallel sides or side are supplementary. The adjacent angles connected to the non-parallel side are supplementary. So if I'm looking at the non-parallels, I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at this. That means these 2 angles and those 2 angles. Right? Each set of those are supplementary. Again, supplementary meaning they make 180 degrees. All right, and that finishes that branch. So we have to feed now off the other branch of trapezoid. The other branch of trapezoid leads us to the parallelogram. As you can see, there's a whole lot going on there in that parallelogram based on little marks in there. Not that many properties though. First property says that the opposite sides are congruent and parallel. So the sides that are across from each other, top down or left, right, are congruent and parallel. Second one says the opposite angles are congruent. That's the angles that are diagonally across from each other. The opposite angles are congruent. And the final property says that the adjacent angles are supplementary. Those are angles that would be connected to each other by a side. So for instance, if I'm looking at this angle, I can go to this angle because they're connected by that side. For this one, I can go here because they're connected by that side. Again, the adjacent angles are supplementary. Okay. Parallelogram. Now we've got 2 options from there. I can go left to rhombus or right to rectangle. Let's go left to rhombus. Okay. Rhombus, what I usually tell people, it's like I took a square and I kind of tilted it to its side. Right? Because a rhombus is a lot like a square in a lot of ways. Properties of a rhombus. First of all, it has all the properties of a parallelogram. So everything that was true about parallelogram is true about rhombus. It has 4 congruent sides, which is why I said it's like a square. All the sides have exactly the same length. diagonals form right angles. Again, the diagonals are the dashed lines that I've drawn from corner to corner. As you can see, I've got the right angle mark in there. They happen to make a perfect right angle. If I drew it well, which I can't because I'm not a good artist, but if I could, they would make a perfect right angle. And the diagonals bisect each other. We've already talked about bisect today. Okay, bisect means they cut each other perfectly in half. All right, let's head off the other branch of parallelogram to a shape you're very familiar with, rectangle. Again, a rectangle has all the properties of a parallelogram. It has 4 congruent angles. You know in a rectangle that all the angles make 90 degrees. Right, so everything up there is exactly the same. And it too has the congruent diagonals. So this diagonal and this diagonal have the exact same measure. And the end couldn't come soon enough, luckily for there. As you can see, both rhombus and rectangle feed back into a square, which is where our chart finishes. Square, again, you know this shape, you know most of its properties. Square has 4 congruent sides. Duh. 4 right angles. It's your second duh of the day. It has opposite sides parallel. We'll go for 3 does. These last 2 should be obvious, but not quite as obvious. The fourth one, the diagonals are congruent. So again, that's when you connect the unconnected corners. Those diagonals are congruent. And the diagonals, once again, meet to form right angles.